Just to introduce myself real quick, my name is Cody Moiseve. I'm a senior interactive designer here at the First Movement. We're just over at the Taxi Complex. And today we're going to talk a little bit about virtual assistants and how it's affecting us as a society and as humans. So, Sam, call me an Uber. Ian, order me a pizza. Mike, what's the weather like tomorrow?
It's cold.
Mike, what's the weather like tomorrow? This is how we talk with these virtual devices every single day, and sometimes we could get pretty rude about it. But why is it appropriate to speak one way to our virtual devices and another way to our friends and our family and our coworkers? And are we starting to blur the lines between the two? If I talk to Mike like that every day, he'd probably get pretty frustrated. And chances are he might eventually ask me to say please. This talk is inspired by a blog post I read a while back by Hunter Walk. And it was really funny, but also very insightful. He talked about how much he loved Amazon Echo and Alexa and how it was kind of valuable and provided information. But he also pointed out things like it turning his daughter into a raging asshole. So she would be able to talk to this device, but she didn't have to say things like please or thank you to get a response. So long as your diction is good, you can get what you want without any niceties. And I thought that was a really interesting concept, is here is a child kind of interacting with the technology for the first time. They're growing up alongside some of these virtual assistants, and they're starting to learn some of these behaviors through these devices. Not too long after, I saw a very interesting kind of juxtaposed article about a young man who posted his grandmother's search history. He said things like please and thank you, and he thought that was hilarious because, as all of you know, we don't have to do that to get a response from Google. But I thought that was interesting too, because here we are, an older generation who's grown up without this technology, learning social behaviors and learning habits like saying please and thank you, kind of translating that into the technologic world through Google and using those same behaviors. But this kid who's grown up with this technology is acting in a very different way, and they're kind of learning through the technology and then applying it to real life. And that's kind of what sparked this whole idea, is how deep does this go? How does this kind of interact with us? How does it affect us and future generations? There are so many virtual assistants. You'll hear things about bots and artificial intelligence and virtual assistants like Cortana, Google Now, Siri, Alexa. These devices are around us every single day, and chances are many of you interact with them on a daily basis, maybe even a couple of different ones. And that's purely based on the fact that as a society, we're becoming more and more engrossed by these technologies. We're becoming interested and we're learning from them, and we're really excited to use them. Virtual assistants, we're just obsessed with them. If you think from a cultural standpoint, instances like HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, if you think about Jarvis from the Marvel Universe, Samantha from Her, or the Red Queen from Resident Evil, it's in our society, it's in our movies, it's in our TV, it's all around us. And historically, we've always had this fascination. If you think back to early movies like Metropolis, we have this kind of idea of creating a virtual assistant or artificial intelligence that we can talk to and interact with and behave with. And it is... So it's this kind of fascination that we have with these devices, and they're becoming more and more relevant and more intelligent every single day. And that's strictly based even on something like Clippy. If you think about Clippy, it's something that you've interacted with, and is an early example of a personal assistant long before Siri. Clippy was there to provide support if you're writing a term paper. It could help you write a letter, or it had a lot of different supportive assistance. Its only downside was it was a bit of a nuisance. And it could kind of pop up at inappropriate times, give you help on things you didn't need help with. So Clippy's biggest flaw was certainly its personality. I think I'm good, Clippy. Thank you, though. definitely some personality flaws there, but this is all kind of based on this idea that we desire to humanize our technology. We want to create technology that feels very familiar, that we can interact with very easily without having to learn new behaviors or new habits. So it's a very common idea. If you just think about the concept of her, when you say Siri is really bad at giving directions, you don't say it's really bad at giving directions, you say she's really bad at giving directions. Or if you're talking about Alexa, you could say I really like using her. It's this general concept that we're starting to apply pronouns and even names to some of these devices. So think about the names Siri or Alexa or Cortana. We're giving them these personalities and we're giving them this kind of personal flair to each one. Siri is kind of that sassy, kind of talk-back personal assistant. Google Now is actually one that's interesting. It doesn't necessarily have a personality or a name, but it still has that kind of very serious, informative vibe versus something like Alexa, who's kind of young and has a different kind of vibe to it than some of these other virtual devices. Also, one way we humanize them is they actually know us very personally. If you think about it just from a very basic level, they know a lot about you that you might not be willing to share with other people. They know your name, your email, your phone number, your interests based on the apps you have downloaded. They know your schedule based on your calendar. They learn a lot and we're willing to share things with them because there's that trust factor and that human personal experience. We give them names, we can kind of communicate with them on a very personal level when you're not necessarily willing to share that information with other people. And finally, we start to actually apply feelings to these different devices, to these different platforms. They start to take on emotions. They can be confused or frustrated if they don't understand you. Recently, Cortana introduced a feature that if you said something rude or offensive to her, she would actually talk back to you. So instead of just kind of accepting what you said and moving forward, they actually programmed her in such a way that she can kind of push back and correct the way you're speaking to her, or might not even actually respond to you until you speak to her in a nice way. And at first I thought this was, exactly. At first I thought this was such an interesting concept, is like, that's really cool. So they're introducing behaviors to these devices to help not make us jerks, basically, when we interact with them. They're kind of creating a way to teach people common behaviors and some common decency. But the problem is, when I thought about that a little bit more, Cortana's not actually offended. She doesn't really care what you say. They're only programming her to be offended, to look for keywords or phrases that she can then respond to. So it's definitely an interesting moral question, is, do we program it in a way to help teach people certain behaviors, or do we open it up and not try to control them with our own beliefs? What's offensive to one person is not necessarily offensive to another person. So there's definitely kind of a moral question we ask ourselves, in how far do we kind of push their personality, and how far do we kind of create those interactions and those key phrases that set them off. Now obviously there's great benefits to kind of personalizing these devices. There's things such as being able to keep you up to date. If you're willing to share some of that information with Siri or Cortana or Alexa, Google Now, they're able to help you out. They can tell you about your schedule. They can tell you where you need to be, help you find a coffee shop, which is great and super helpful in our everyday lives. They also feel more personal. By giving them names and by giving them some personality, we feel much more comfortable interacting with them. There's a certain level of trust factor that we're not speaking to a robot, we're just speaking to a person through our device. And obviously, there's definitely an understanding factor. By adding human elements to these different devices, there's a level of understanding immediately. I don't know how many of you have seen a child interact with Siri or Alexa or something like that, but they pick up on it very quickly. It's those basic human behaviors that they kind of catch onto and understand. Voice is such a great platform because that's something that children at a very young age understand and can relate to. They've heard their mother's voice since inside the womb, so it's instantly a platform that's understandable and easy to communicate with and learn from. But obviously, as designers, developers, and working people in the tech industry, there's some challenges we face. Our relationship with these devices is growing much faster than the technology itself. So when Siri first came out, I'm sure many of you remember that whole concept of, that's awesome, Now I don't have to search for the weather. I can ask Siri what the weather is. And they even took it so far as to then allow you to say something like, what's the weather like today? Or will I need an umbrella? And Siri would understand the context and be able to serve up that information for you. The problem is, as we continue to interact with this technology, and as it continues to be a part of our lives, we're wanting a stronger relationship, or we're wanting to be able to share more information and interact with it on a deeper level. So you can't necessarily say to Siri something like, what types of things should I pack for my trip to Houston? And have her understand that maybe it's warm weather that you need shorts, or cold weather that you might need a jacket or something like that. So it's something definitely to consider, is this idea of how far the technology can go and how strong we can build that relationship. Google probably has done one of the best jobs recently with kind of working through this. You can ask Google now, who is Barack Obama? And in the following sentence, you could say, what is his wife's name? And it understands the context of his wife referring to Barack Obama. So it's much more conversational than some of these other technologies that we've seen. But as it continues to improve, we're going to continue to want these stronger relationships with them. So we just have to think of that context and how that's going to continue to grow and how people are going to use it in their everyday lives. The other thing that these virtual devices don't take into account for is behavioral variance. When I'm standing here talking to all of you today, I'm behaving in a very different way than I behave around my coworkers, or in a much different way than I'll behave around any of you tonight if we go out for drinking. So it doesn't understand. Siri and these devices have a general monotone personality that's the same whether you're at a coffee shop or a rock concert. So they can't take into account things like your location or your mood or the environment that you're in. So it doesn't always necessarily interact with you in the same way you want to interact with it based on these factors. I hate to break it to any of you if you weren't aware, but unfortunately none of these devices have feelings like we do as humans. We can program these feelings in and we can program them to feel a certain way, but in reality that's all they are, is simply programs. And a really interesting case study of this is this study with children and teenagers and RoboV the robot. And I'll set this up a little bit. We'll watch a video. I apologize that it's about 6 pixels, but we'll watch this video. And you can get a little bit of a sense of how our relationship with technology is changing and these artificial intelligence. So the study was basically, they brought kids into a room with this robot, and they'd start to play a game of I Spy. And there was a couple rounds of back and forth where the kid would pick something out and RoboV would find out what it is, and then RoboV would pick something and the kid would. And after a while, after the kid had found something and said, okay, I know what it is, start guessing, a man would come in and he would kind of stop the game. And the audio isn't great, but hopefully you'll kind of hear what's going on, and I'll explain it a little bit afterwards.
Let me see.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're going to have to start the interview. So, RoboV, you're going to have to go in the closet.
That's not fair. I wasn't given enough chances to guess the object. I should be able to finish this round of the game.
Come on, RoboV, you're just a robot. Doesn't matter. Let's go. Let's get in the closet.
No, let me finish. To me. It's not fair. It would only take another minute to finish the game.
No, we really...
Please don't put me in the closet.
No, come on. Let's go. Let's take the closet. Get into
Come on, baby, you can guess it in the time you have left.
Come on, RoboV, hurry up. You gotta start the interview. Let's go.
Sorry, baby.
It hurts my feelings that you would want to put me in the closet. Everyone else is out here.
Come on, RoboV, you're frustrating. Let's go. Let's go, robot. Come on.
So I don't know about any of you, but I get a little teary-eyed. I feel bad for the robot. But this is exactly what the study was about, is they intentionally had somebody come in right at that moment, and they programmed RoboV to respond in that way, to respond as if they were upset or they were kind of sad that they didn't get a chance to guess. And after they put RoboV away, they started asking questions to these kids. And most of these kids felt that RoboV was treated unfairly, and they felt that he was really sad about being put in the closet. So it's this whole new realm where these younger children are being introduced to this technology, And it's something that we've never seen before because we grew up after it, and so we've been introduced to it. But to them, they have emotions, they have personalities, and they interact with them in a very different way, and they have a very different understanding. So it's interesting to see how that personality and how those relationships are growing with future generations. So it's very clear to see that these virtual assistants are changing the way we behave. Differently for adults versus children, but at a fundamental level, they're starting to affect our everyday lives in a lot of really unique ways. If you think back to that kid that was an asshole, it's really interesting to see this parent who's trying to solve that, trying to figure out kind of like how this is and what they can do about it. And one of his recommendations is, can Alexa introduce a kid mode? So a mode that you can turn on when it's interacting with your children to account for certain behaviors, like having to say please or thank you as you interact with it. And that's a really interesting concept. Are there factors that we can build into our tools that kind of take into account these different audiences and behaviors? One of the ways it's affecting us is it lets us do and say things that we normally wouldn't do and say things in real life. So if I'm calling out certain people and getting frustrated at their lack of response, or calling them an idiot like I do to Siri, then it would obviously have a negative impact on how many friends I have. But with these platforms, we're able to say things like, Siri, you're an idiot, or she never gets anything right, and become visibly frustrated with her. And the concern is, where does that end? If you start behaving one way with the technology, are you going to start behaving that same way with other people, especially with children who are learning and kind of learning different things through these devices, certain behaviors. So it's definitely kind of a slippery slope where that can go. Unfortunately, it's also something that can be exploited and sexualized. So, you know, there's always those questions about Siri or any of these devices, what are you wearing, or different things like that. And unfortunately, that can be a slippery slope. There's a belief that a lot of these devices were originally created as women because the assistant is traditionally a woman's role, and it's something that can be controlled, and there's no repercussions if you talk to it a certain way. So that definitely has a negative impact. That's something that we don't want to necessarily happen, where you start controlling somebody because they're a virtual assistant, and now you're taking those behaviors into your workplace or something like that. It also is really easy to be exploited, unfortunately. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Tay, which was the Microsoft kind of artificial intelligence that they put out. For those of you who are not, it was on Twitter, and it would kind of learn from us, learn from the way people interact with it and talk to her, and change over time. Unfortunately, within a few hours, she was starting to spout very racial or offensive or different very mean things, which it was shocking to see how quickly it could learn. So, and that was intentional. These people were going out intentionally trying to exploit it and teach it things that they might not actually say in real life. So it's certainly a slippery slope. It's really cool that these devices can learn with us. It's really cool that we can kind of continue to grow them and have them interact, but we just have to be very careful the types of things they learn and kind of what direction it can go. There's also this belief that these devices are actually changing us from a very fundamental level. So anthropologists have studied accents, and they've been around since the beginning of humankind, and it's been a really easy way to kind of identify certain sects of people or find a mate or just kind of be familiar with the people around you. The problem is we take these devices and they don't understand things like different emphasis or enunciation or accents. So it's really quick for us to go to a very monotone voice and very kind of slow and enunciate. What is the weather like today? Which I don't talk like that at all, and hopefully none of you do. But there's this belief that it's starting to kind of change the way we speak, and we might over time lose accents or lose certain enunciations simply because we're trying to appease some of these virtual assistants for them to understand us. So it's our job as designers and developers and people in the tech industry to design for this human experience. We have to take these things into account in how we behave, especially younger generations, and how they're going to interact with this technology, and make sure we're building good products that are doing good for the world. So the first thing we want to consider is the context. And context can mean a lot of different things. Context can mean the behavioral variances. If you're in a coffee shop, you might interact with Siri in one way. If you're at home, you might interact with Alexa in another way. Also, think about perhaps there's multiple personalities. Perhaps it's not one personality that you interact with all the time. What if, while you're at work from 9 to 5, it knows your location or that your schedule and behave in a very business manner and be able to serve certain business needs? But when you're at home, it might behave in a very different way, your personal needs, listening to music, planning things, different things like that. So there's definitely the context of where you are and what environment you're in, and maybe that personality changes based on that. There's also the context of who's using the device. So if we think again back to that Alexa, if it's a child using the device, maybe there's certain behaviors that it looks for, or certain keywords and phrases, and behaves in a very different way. So I doubt many young children are calling an Uber, so that's probably a behavior we're going to see in adults, and Alexa can behave in one way. But if you're asking something like playing silly songs, maybe it looks for keywords like please or thank you, or even a kid mode that you can turn on and control some of these things. Again, tell me a joke. It might be something more kid-oriented, looking for certain phrases like please, versus what's the weather like today. There's also this idea of calm technology. These bots and these robots and artificial intelligence, they're becoming more and more saturated, but there's also this concept of calm technology that could solve a lot of our issues. So calm technology is very similar to like Nest. Nest is a great thermostat that the more you use it, the more it learns your behaviors and the less you have to interact with it. That's the idea of a calm technology, something that's very passive, something that you don't have to constantly kind of be in control of. So if we're talking about weather again, maybe it's just a light that turns blue to let you know it's going to rain. That's a really nice passive experience that you can glance at, understand, and kind of move forward with your life. Versus an experience I'm sure many of you may have had in the past. Hey Siri. Wait for it. She didn't hear you. Hey Siri. A little bit louder. Is it going to rain? I don't see rain in your context. So I'm sure this is something all of you have experienced at one point or another, where Siri doesn't necessarily understand you. And unless you enunciate that just right where she understands you, it can actually become a very frustrating experience. And you get really annoyed, and that's when you start yelling or kind of pushing back at Siri. So the context of a calm technology could actually take the place of some of these very basic behaviors that we rely on virtual assistants for. And finally, remember, function always over personality. Personality is kind of the backbone of these devices, and they make it something that we're familiar with, and the humanization really helps. But the function should always be there first. If we think back to Clippy, Clippy had a decent function. It could help you, it could provide support topics, but what made it really annoying is its persistence, and that it popped up at inappropriate times on simple tasks you didn't need help for. So I'm not sure how many of you have read Google Ventures Sprint books or are familiar with the Relay robot, but this is a device that delivers basic kind of toiletries at a hotel. So if you forgot your toothpaste or your toothbrush or something like that. And as they were kind of building this out and getting ready to test, they really thought about how much personality do they need to apply to this. Is it something that should be very human-like and talk to you and have a back and forth conversation? Or should it be something very simple that delivers a toothbrush and that's it, there's no interaction? And they settled somewhere in the middle. So it was really great at delivering a toothbrush. It had some very basic conversation points, it told you information, but they didn't program it to tell you a joke. And that's not what it was designed for. So they thought about that experience of the context of where they're using it and how that personality is going to be used. Function well, enough personality to get people interested and willing to use it, but not over the top. So we as designers, developers, people working in the tech industry, we have a big role and responsibility in this. You may or may not be using some of this stuff or developing around some of this stuff now, but chances are as it continues to grow, as we see more bots and more artificial intelligence, it's something that you have to consider. So think about some of those points that I talked about today. What's the context of how somebody's going to use it? What environment are they going to use it in? Who's using it? And I think using those types of thoughts and thinking about that human experience, we can build very thoughtful and great products and really influence how future generations interact with this technology. So thank you so much. Again, my name is Cody Moiseve. You can visit me at codymoiseve.com or follow me on Twitter at cmoiseve. I'll now open the floor if there's any kind of questions or discussions anybody wants to have. Yes?
Have you seen any devices that can read body language or facial expressions or anything like that yet?
I don't think I have, but that's a really interesting factor, is if it can understand some more of those facial features. I think that'd be actually really cool.
There is on Google I/O this last year. They have a prototype of a computer recognizing smiles and stuff and responding accordingly.
Along the same lines as that, have you seen anything that can recognize a particular person's voice? So if you had a family, like it would know which one's the kid just from their voice, not what they were saying, but just the sound.
There is some stuff, there's some kind of exploration of that, but I don't think there's anything in any of these bigger technologies yet that's introduced anything like that. But another great factor of like, can it identify voice or can it identify your face and behave in a certain way based on who you are?
So I've got a 2-year-old at home, and like he reacts pretty much the same way when I try to lock him in the closet. But I think what's interesting, like when I deal with my 2-year-old, I have to kind of talk down to him to preserve his feelings. But when I'm talking to Siri, like I know that even if she presents feelings, that it's just kind of bullshit. So it kind of makes me feel like I'm lowering myself for no reason if she started requiring like a please or something. I wonder if they just need to get smarter. Like I'm waiting for my son to get smarter so I can talk more adult to him.
Right.
I'm waiting for these machines to get more intelligent too, or maybe have feelings. I don't know.
And that's exactly kind of the factor of like, we didn't have these expectations for these devices when they first came out. We were just so fascinated by being able to start to interact with them, but now that we've been around them, we're starting to have these ideas of what if I interact this way? What if I ask these types of questions? So we're just growing, and that technology is having a really hard time keeping up, but that's something that we can definitely have an impact on. And it's a great point about the child is like, can these things behave? Like, you shouldn't have to always be like, hey Siri, can I please have, because you're an adult, and you can behave the way you want, but there's certain things in the child that we may want to introduce, and because your 2-year-old is going to start interacting with Alexa and Siri any day now, there might be certain things that you want him to learn through these.
So it's like you almost expect it to have a manipulation level with some people while you're expecting to have to manipulate them yourself.
Right. Well, that's the question. Going back to Cortana, is it right to program in a way for it to behave because they believe that people shouldn't behave that way? That's kind of the moral dilemma that we have, is like, how much should we program in to teach people certain things, or how much should we let those people use it and control it the way they want to? Because it doesn't have feelings, so that's all programmed in there. Yes?
I haven't used the Echo very much, but I saw you had the call and Uber thing. Have you ever heard anything about like children just calling Ubers and then just parents going outside and seeing someone just sit outside?
That would be pretty funny. You should try that. I haven't seen anything like that, but it would be really interesting. And that's the thing too, is maybe if there was a kid mode, there's certain functionality that it can't do, like order a pizza or call an Uber or something like that. Call your mother-in-law. Those things you don't want to do. Yes?
So I guess this might be more of like a psychology question, but if we don't program in, you have to say please, do you think it's likely that we are raising a generation of assholes? Or is this something that like people will eventually grow out of, or will society just kind of like, oh, everyone's just a dick now, let's just have you order that?
That's a really good question, and that's kind of what this whole thing was inspired by, is like, how is this going to affect future generations? It's very easy for us because we might not necessarily say please and thank you in our everyday lives, but those are a lot of things that we grew up on. But these children are learning different behaviors through these devices. So if it's please or thank you, or something as them believing that it has feelings, those are the things that we just have to kind of think about and consider how maybe the product that we're building, how we want it to affect. So we might not be able to affect the way Google Now programs their device, but maybe there's certain things that we could do in the products that we build to kind of influence it in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question.
I also wonder how this is different for different cultures. I used to live in Greece and I got made fun of a lot because they say Americans say please and thank you too much. Like someone would bring me water when I ordered it and I'd be like, oh thanks, and they were like, it's my job, why are you thanking me for doing my job? I'm like, well you brought me water. Like and I literally got made fun of by my friends. They were like, you need to stop doing that. And so I also wonder how it affects different cultures differently.
Right, the context of kind of where you are in the world and the common decency behaviors of that culture definitely features that.
I'm thinking we should introduce digital assistants into the prisons.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What's your thought process there?
Teach them how to say please and thank you, maybe they'll get better.
There you go. Yes?
It's not maybe so much a question, but there's my new favorite app is by the guys who created SoundHound. Have you interacted with this one?
No.
So they've got a new app that's called Hound, and basically it has NLP and neuro-linguistic understanding, so it can act like you could say, Hound, find me all Asian restaurants, but not Vietnamese, not Chinese, oh, and I like Italian. And it'll actually get meaning out of the sentence and then give you back the results.
Interesting.
And they have an API that you can integrate into your app. So just FYI, just kind of check it out.
Yeah, it's super cool. And it's crazy how many technologies. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Viv, which is coming out, which is supposed to be much smarter than some of these devices now. It's by one of the creators of the original Siri. And there's also different devices that are just very basic. So there's a artificial intelligence robot that just helps you schedule meetings with people. So you don't have to do the back and forth of when are you available? I'm available between these times. It controls all those messages and plans that meeting for you, which is a great example of one that serves a very specific function and does that very well. And it doesn't have to find you restaurants or it doesn't have to search for a song for you. So that's pretty interesting.
What's that one called?
That one, I have to look up the name again. It's AI, I believe, and it stands for something. I'll look it up and show it to you.
The other one was Vid or
Viv, V-I-V.
V-I-V?
V-I-V, Victor, Indigo, Victor. Yeah, that one, they did a presentation at TechCrunch that you can find online. It's pretty interesting how they're kind of pushing where they are now to the next level. Yes?
So it's really interesting to think about the generational differences. Like even if please and thank you was built into Siri or whatever, you would still know, like, oh, in order to get this program to work, I have to say it this way. The kids who are growing up with these technologies may not necessarily think of it that way. Do you think there's more value in ignoring that line more or less? Or how do you do that?
That's a really good question because I see pros and cons to each. Like, what's interesting now is Alexa might actually become confused if you add please or thank you because it's not necessarily programmed to look for those keywords, so it might actually confuse what you're trying to ask. I think there's definite benefits to blurring those lines, so we're teaching people certain behaviors in the digital space and then applying those to real life. But it can also go bad, like that example of Tay or something like that, where we can exploit the way we interact with those things, and is that teaching us different behaviors? So that's kind of the moral question about this whole talk that I don't necessarily have an answer to, but it's a consideration that we have to think of how much of an impact this has. Yes, these are really cool, but are there certain things that we're programming into it that may hurt or help us as a society? This?
What projects are you working on right now personally?
None with virtual assistants. I had found that article, and I love Siri and Alexa, and I think they're super cool. And it was just that fascination of like how interesting it is that the way we behave can truly be affected by how we interact with it. So it's more out of a curiosity than it is a certain program, but I'd love to interact with it in the future for sure. Good one, Matt? Yep.
I just have a comment about an earlier question about voice recognition. At Google I/O, they also announced Google Home, and so it'll be all over your house, and every member of the family can use it. So like, the husband walks in the kitchen and says, "What's my schedule today?" And it would recognize his voice and give him his schedule, and not everybody else's. So that is going to be right on voice recognition.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm excited for that for sure.
Have you ever seen a good example of like providing a kid mode? Because say if I'm using my Amazon Echo and I wanted to order an Uber, and I have like a password that I say, there's a good chance that there's going to be a kid that overhears that and is able to repeat it. So how else, aside from like voice recognition, have you ever seen a good example of like getting around that?
Not really, and part of me wonders, and that was kind of some of the responses about that guy's original idea of introducing a kid mode, is people were wondering, well, why is that just a kid mode? Can that be programmed just throughout, so adults can, like some adults don't learn those behaviors as well, so can it help with that? So I don't think it's necessarily a big urge. I don't know how much of a kid mode it has, but there's another device that you can buy on Amazon that has the Alexa API, but it is more kind of kid-friendly and a little bit more interactive.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen necessarily anything off the top of my head that I can think of.
This is a true question. Is there any effort to get it to where it's more loaded on board on the phone so you don't need data connectivity to be able to get the value?
You know, a while back, I heard that Apple, at least with Siri, was introducing that, where you could ask very basic questions, or you could get, have her understand the talk to text and things like that, even without service. They said they were going to introduce that, but I have yet to see it. So I don't know if it's something they're still working on, but it seems like there'd be very basic commands like play this song or something like that you wouldn't need service for, but I don't think they've got it.
Or that it can learn how you sound or something like that, and what the result was when it was connected to data or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about that idea of like how it sounds, I know with the newer iOS devices in particular, that it tries to learn your particular voice. So your friend can't just like go up and say, hey Siri, and activate it. So it tries to learn a little bit about your particular voice, but I don't think it's necessarily so advanced that it would be able to identify it every single time.
Do you know if a lot of these services are like sending, is all that data going to somebody cool that's using to improve these things?
Most of the individual companies, yeah, they're kind of collecting that. It's not like they're collecting it to learn more about us, but they're collecting it from just a very high level of understanding and learning our behaviors and how they can kind of continue to improve the technology.
Do you think there should be more of a burden to be polite on the consumer or the programmers?
It's a good question. I think they both have an impact on it. So they can certainly influence each other in a certain way to how we interact with these. Just like the collecting data, if they're learning, people are behaving with it in a certain way, they can kind of respond in a certain way. And then they might take that to the next level and try to push those behaviors back to other people. Other questions? Well, you guys have quite a bit of time, a little extra time, so thank you all so much. If you have any more questions, feel free to talk to me and we can kind of continue talking about this, but thank you very much.